All right, everybody, we're live and we're here with episode 26. It's hard to believe we've made it this far. Episode 26, I'm joined by,
Scott Wilson.
and I am Stevie Stroh, and we're here talking about something that I know I'm thankful for. Hopefully, you're thankful for this too. But this week, we're going to talk about Disney Plus's. Is that the right way to pluralize Disney Plus? But on Disney Plus, Andor is the topic of this week.
Yes, sir. I've been waiting for this one.
And so you want to go ahead and kick it off, Scott?
Okay, well, let's kick it off. Let's kick it off. Should I kick it off with my overall thoughts, or should I do some sort of preamble? How do we start this?
How
Oh,
about we start at the beginning? In the beginning, there was the beginning,
yes.
and before the beginning, there was the prequels.
In the beginning, there was Star Wars, and that was 1977. Now we're in 2022, and Star Wars has become even more of a multimedia franchise than it was initially. And the latest offering, well, maybe not the latest because I don't know, because I was watching Tales of the Jedi last night with my mom, but the most significant of the latest offerings is the show Andor. And I believe this show to be one of the greatest things that has ever bore the Star Wars brand name. That's my personal opinion, and I would include the Mandalorian in that particular conversation. But Andor is just pretty amazing. A friend of mine described it as the wire for Star Wars.
Okay.
I've had other friends describe it as sort of a, well, not friends, but I've seen certain reviews. It's described as a BBC spy show. That the tone is very similar to a BBC spy show. The tone is deliberate. It's deliberately paced or leisurely paced, or however, it's not the typical adventure serial format that we're used to that George Lucas established for both Star Wars and Indiana Jones, where everything is constant cliffhangers, constant close calls, constant getting in and out of trouble, constant adventure. Andor is an adventure story, but not that kind of an adventure story. Andor is an adventure story where there are actual conversations between characters, conversations about real issues, where everything is not dependent on blaster fire or lightsaber clashes. And that's what makes Andor so wonderful. And I think that it's a much different take on Star Wars than we've ever seen before. What do you think, Steve?
I would agree with everything you said. I think the best two words to describe the streaming series Andor is slow burn, right? And for those not familiar with this is the story that takes place before Rogue One, which is the story that is about the basically the forming of the rebellion and the people who stole the plans to hand to Princess Leia that allowed them to blow up the Death Star in the original first Star Wars movie. So Rogue One was the story of the people who sacrificed all to get those plans to destroy the Death Star. And so we are now going back a year or two from Rogue One, and now it's really the story of building the rebellion and the cost to build a rebellion and what's at stake. And there's so many great lines of, what has this cost me? What have I sacrificed? And I've sacrificed everything. I'm ready to burn for a future that I'm not going to see and things like that. So, yeah, absolutely. I mentioned this on a previous episode where I felt like Rogue One is in my top four favorite Star Wars movies. I feel it is as good with the original trilogy from 1977 to 1983, the original run of Star Wars back in the day. And I feel it's of the same caliber of those movies. And in many ways, I feel it's a little bit more intense because it's much less of a fantasy, where Star Wars was a space
Right.
fantasy. This was more of a space drama. And was literally the story of a suicide mission where, they literally had to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And so there's a lot of that going on in Andor. It is not got nothing to do with the Jedis. It's got nothing to do with lightsabers. It's got nothing to do with Darth Vader or the Force, but it is an epic Star Wars story worth watching.
Okay, so like you said before, this is one of those rare times when both of us are pretty much in sync. in terms of our opinion about a show or a movie. This is one of those rare times. Uh, Now, at the top of the show, we do have to say, spoilers, but that kind of goes without saying for us. There's going to be spoilers here, so if you haven't seen Andor, hit pause on either your screen or on your whatever podcast app you're using. Just hit the pause button and then come back to us once you've seen the full show, because from here on out, no more spoiler warnings. We're just going to kind of talk freely, and we're going to mention key plot points, character beats, you name it. So from here on out, I kind of want to hop around a bit. I'm not going to go in order per se, but I want to talk a bit about the stretch of the show that becomes a prison film. And that's what's interesting about this show, is it kind of in a way it defies categorization. There are portions of it, there are story arcs within it that play like a heist film. There are story arcs in it that play like a small ground war. There are story arcs in it that play like a prison film. And the prison portion is very interesting to me because, as many people have pointed out, it harkens back to what is known as pre-Star Wars 1970s sci-fi. Sci-fi looked and felt a certain way in the 70s before Star Wars came along. I'm talking about movies like Soylent Green. I'm talking about movies like Silent Running. I'm talking about movies like The Omega Men. And I'm also talking about one particular film that Andor, the prison portion of Andor, references, and that is a George Lucas movie,
THX?
THX 1138. Now, a lot of people probably have not seen. I would wager that most people who have ever seen a Star Wars film have never even heard of THX 1138, except when they see the introduction screen for the George Lucas sound system.
Right, right. And for those who don't know, that was basically one of George Lucas's student films that then became one of his first feature films, and
Yes.
it was way out there.
Oh, it was way out there. It was trippy. It was, would it be called dystopian? I'm not sure. I don't know if that word would apply here, but uh, it's not necessarily a lot of fun to watch. It's nowhere near as fun as Star Wars or Indiana Jones or even American Graffiti. But it's a very interesting film. It's one of those movies that when you see it, even if you weren't necessarily entertained, you can't really get it out of your head once you see it. There's lots of very interesting ideas in there. One idea is the idea of a prison that's just an endless void, a prison without walls. How do you escape a prison without walls? It's just, a really trippy idea, and it just shows you, Star Wars doesn't give a full picture of who George Lucas really is as an artist. There's a lot of different aspects to even the way he approaches sci-fi. And this isn't the first homage to THX 113. A rap group called Gangstar back in 1998 had a single called You Know My Steez. And the whole video is basically a remake of THX 1138, which was funny to me at the time because I can guarantee you a very small portion of rap fans had ever even heard of that film. But yeah, it was just interesting to watch now that Star Wars is no longer under the wing of George Lucas, to see the people who do have it paying homage to another one of his films within a Star Wars property that they created. That's kind of wild.
Right.
But yeah, that prison portion, I dare to say that was probably the strongest. That was the strongest arc or portion of a very strong show.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing. What I liked about I really can't think of anything I didn't like about it, but there's so many things I do like, and again, in no particular order. So the prison thing, when you talk about escaping a prison without walls in THX, well, this was very much a prison that had a very good confining mechanism, which was the whole kind of floor that will kill you. Like they're all barefoot, and the floor can go
Yes.
hot and like kind of electrocute you or whatever it does on the spot. So that's certainly a way to keep the population in line. But it's interesting to see that this is basically a prison work camp, and the Empire is taking prisoners to build something. Now, what that something they were building was revealed in the final post credit scene of the final episode of the season. But they're working on parts, and they're working, in shifts, and they're working as a team, and they're being basically kind of measured in their efficiency and their effectiveness. How quickly can we build these parts? How many parts can we build per shift? And it's a competition against the other kind of teams in here, but the loser gets punished in a way. It's some pretty harsh stuff. It is a prison work camp. And I remember in one of the first scenes when Cassian is brought in and he has to learn about the food. Everybody's got basically like a little tiny bunk, and there's a little feeding tube in there, and you're basically like sucking paste through a straw like astronaut food. And one of his like bunk mates or whatever was saying, if you do a really good job, the reward is they put some flavor in the food. I mean, how freaking harsh is that? Where you're basically sucking on plain oatmeal, and if you're lucky, they'll put some brown sugar and cinnamon in there for you. It's just, that's the prison life. I mean, that's pretty hardcore. The whole thing was really hard to imagine, but I really liked how they showed the Empire in this role of being what we would consider to be the world police, in this case, the galaxy police, and how they are enforcing their law, their martial law, and the consequences for breaking the law. If it's not, if you're not being executed, you're sentenced to life of hard labor. It's pretty harsh. It's a pretty harsh world that is a little bit more grinding than we got to see in the first Star Wars movie. That was Episode 4, A New Hope. You knew the Empire was bad. We didn't know how bad.
Well, that's true, and I also think that this show, many elements of it, sort of harken back to something that Empire Strikes Back introduced into the Star Wars lexicon. And what I mean is, The Empire Strikes Back, one of the greatest things about that film, which now so many fans recognize as the best Star Wars film ever, for good reason, one of the things that film introduced was a real sense of fear and despair into the language of Star Wars. The first film was very much, like you said, a space opera, science fantasy, like the adventure serials that Lucas and Spielberg grew up watching in the 40s and 50s on television, the Old Republic serials. But Empire sort of allowed the franchise to go to some very dark places, to places where moments like when Luke is going into that tree to face something that he doesn't, when he's on Dagobah, to face something that he doesn't know what it is, and that he says, "I feel cold, death."
Right.
Even the film ending on such a down note, it added this sense of there are parts to this universe that you may not want to venture into blindly because bad things are waiting there. And Andor had a lot of those kinds of elements. There was a scene, I have to watch this episode again to get a keener understanding of it. There was a scene with a female character where she was being interrogated. What were they using to torture her? They were using some kind of sounds. What were they using?
Yeah, so what it was is they found some type of creature, and they discovered that upon this creature's death, it releases a sound that is just so horrific that it really screws with people. And so I think they had recorded the sound of this dying creature, and then would play that sound because it just screws with your psyche and your brain and your sanity and your spirit and everything. And it's just hearing that sound for whatever reason was so torturous that over time it just breaks your spirit and breaks your will.
Now, again, in the spirit of THX, what kind of an idea is that? That's just such a crazy idea, and yet it's also in a way very perfectly Star Wars.
It's like, yeah, we're gonna play a soundtrack of burning babies until you give us what we want. Is basically kind of what this freaking sound was the equivalent of.
Yeah, but I love stuff like that. That's what I mean. I mean, it really gets you invested, and it really creates a sense of stakes. And it's also, I like how it plays with your emotions, because you're sitting there wondering what sound could possibly do whatever it's doing to this woman.
Right,
You,
and if you, sorry to interrupt you there, but in the prison scene where they're trying to interrogate Princess Leia in the first Star Wars movie,
yes,
they had the probe droid come in, and it had basically like a big giant needle sticking
needle.
out of it that was kind
Yes.
of coming towards the camera before it faded to black. And where that needle was going, or what they were going to do with that needle, hard to say. You know, some people have a fear of needles. In the 1977, seeing a hovering,
Globe.
interrogation droid coming towards you with a big needle pointing right at you, that is fairly, frightening. But in 2022, we kind of have to up the stakes on what is considered frightening, especially since this woman, I think her name was Bix, she's kind of a rebel. She's probably used to some form of pain and enduring pain. So trying to threaten her with a hypodermic syringe was probably not going to work anyways.
No, it's not enough.
Yeah,
That's
not
not
enough
enough.
for her. But yeah.
And and also, I mean, and there's so many great elements and subplots to this show. We have the disgraced security officer who pretty much was demoted or fired for doing his job, and then he becomes this stalker, and he
Yeah.
stalks.
And so again, the things you love and the details that they put in there. By the way, we have somebody watching us live right now, Derpy501st. Shout out, thanks for watching. Who says Andor is better than Mando? Yeah, I said it. Well, I enjoyed it more than Mando, and Andor didn't need merchandise to get a season two. Just saying, you didn't have to sell
Well,
any toys.
Derpy, I'll split the difference with you. I definitely think Andor is technically a better show than The Mandalorian. I think The Mandalorian is more fun to watch just because of the nature of it. The Mandalorian is very much an adventure serial. It's Lone Wolf and Cub. If you've
Mm-hmm.
ever if you ever read the manga or seen the Baby Cart in Peril series from Japan, samurai traveling with a Ronin traveling with his baby son, and he just basically kills a ton of people along the way. It's kind of it's a fascinating watch. It was There were in the 70s, no, in the early 80s, there was a film called Shogun Assassin, which was a cobbled together version of two or three different Lone Wolf and Cub movies, and given an electronic score, and that kind of was a lot of Americans' introduction. But that property is the Mandalorian, and the Mandalorian is very fun on that level. But
Mm-hmm.
I think Andor is a better show.
Andor is an adult Star Wars,
Yes,
where Mandolin is a PG, family friendly, all ages Star
yes,
Wars experience. So they're really geared towards two different
right.
audiences. I would say if I had to pick my favorite of the two properties, I enjoyed Andor more than I enjoyed The Mandalorian. But I can also see where it's going to be hard to sell toys on
You
characters
can't
that are
sell.
viewed as
Oh,
terrorists and prisoners
dude,
and you
when
know.
when when the
Yeah.
title ca- when
Here,
you have the
here's Kenner's new torture action playset.
right, and when you have the when the titular hero of your show is shown murdering someone in cold blood because they revealed themselves to be a traitor after a heist that took place. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
that's but that's what makes this show so amazing, is that it's like Rogue One. I feel like Rogue One tried to turn Star Wars into an actual war story, which is hard to do over the course of just one movie.
Hmm.
But Andor completes that. Andor makes it an actual war story, not just a sweeping, fantasy with space wizards and
Hmm.
laser swords, but like an actual war story. People actually die. The people on the ground, the people who are not as in touch with the Force as the chosen ones, like Luke and his
Right,
father.
right.
People are forced to do terrible things when fighting back against tyranny. They can't just hop in an X-wing fighter and go to a battle station and throw a torpedo down a shaft. They have to do the groundwork. They have to risk their lives to get the information that allowed Luke to
Right.
do
To
what he
save the
did.
day. Right.
Yeah, and it's just all around. And I just love how Cassian Andor himself is he's the antithesis of the chosen one narrative in the original trilogy, where you have Anakin, who's supposedly the one who is meant to bring balance to the Force. He's prophesized. And by extension, Luke is expected from birth to be the one to end his father's tyranny. Whereas with Cassian Andor, there is no such prophecy for him. There's no story destiny for him. He's just a guy that lurks in the corners of society, a guy that most people don't seem to like very much. But that makes him perfect for the kind of work.
Right. Perfect for recruitment for the mission,
Yes.
and perfect to be expendable if things go wrong.
Yes.
But getting back to the stalker guy you were talking about.
Yeah,
right? So
the
the guy who loses his job and ends up becoming the stalker. What I loved about this was seeing him living at home with his mom, eating cereal for breakfast every morning, eating his freaking, his Fruit Loops cereal and the blue milk.
With a mama's boy with an overbearing mother.
Yeah, you know what I mean? And just when we talk about how grounded and reality based this show was, the fact that the guy lives with his mom and is eating cereal for breakfast, there's so many details. Another thing I liked about it was Coruscant, to me, played a bigger role. Whereas in the prequel movies, Coruscant was kind of the backdrop, and yes, things took place in Coruscant, but I feel like where in episodes 1, 2, and 3 of the prequel trilogy, Coruscant was a little bit more of just backdrop. This one, it almost felt like a character in the story. It was a little bit more story serving to things that were taking on there, you know?
Right.
So seeing it and seeing how, for those who know a little bit about Coruscant as it was presented in episodes 1, 2, and 3, it is kind of the center of the universe. It is a planet whose cities got to be so big that it is a city planet. There's literally no more ground or dirt or trees or anything. It's the where the Republic is started, where the Jedi Order was, all these things. So literally, Coruscant, the city planet, is the center of and the capital of the free universe. And so, but we're seeing this kind of separating of things where Mon Mothma, who is kind of like the senator, how she's got all the spies on her and how she has been doing all this shady side dealings to get the money to fund the rebellion and things like that. So I felt like Coruscant played a bigger role in this and felt more like a character in the story as opposed to just a generic location, in my opinion, or my observation. Maybe I'm just more in tune with it now, 20 years after the prequels,
Well, no, I do like that it becomes more significant. And if you watch Tales of the Jedi, the animated little mini series they just released, and I think they could probably do more. It's a bunch of shorts, each 15 minutes. I think there's about 5 or 6 of them. They go a bit more in depth as to how Coruscant is viewed by people who are outside of the system, so to speak, or people who are not privileged. Coruscant is sort of viewed as like the ivory tower, and the Jedi are viewed by many people as simply being the galaxy police that do the bidding of the politicians on Coruscant, and which again adds some different shades. I think Lucas was hinting at that with the prequels. I think the prequels were meant to sort of not paint the Jedi in the best light, because in the prequels they seemed very stiff, very stodgy, and very arrogant, which is not the picture we got from Obi-Wan Kenobi's descriptions in the original trilogy. So I think, I don't think that the prequels were very good at necessarily painting that picture, but I think that's what they were hinting at, and it adds a few interesting shades here.
Speaking of shades, like when they're asking Anakin, I know we're going way behind Andor at this point, but they're asking Anakin to spy on Chancellor Palpatine, and how they're basically, okay, now that we know who Palpatine is, he's got to go. So they're ready to pull a 187 on him real quick. So they're asking him to do some shady espionage type things, and they're ready to kill a guy. So the great white knights of the Republic, the Jedis, guys. Well, they can be some shady sons of bitches too. But let's not go too far back to the prequels. Let's try to pull it
Sorry,
back into
sorry
Andor.
about that.
No, that's
Yeah.
okay. Not your fault. I mentioned Coruscant. That's what brought us back there. But I don't want to try to pull us back into Andor. But yeah, you were talking about the shady guy. I talked about him eating cereal. I talked about Coruscant. Back to you, Scott.
Okay. No, again, I liked every character. I just liked every character. The guy who's basically seems to be the mastermind behind the entire rebellion, the guy who deals in antiquities and art
Yeah. Yes.
and
And
things like
the
that.
double role of him there too.
And that's such a perfect cover because you need money to fund a rebellion. So what better way than to have some sort of high-end art store where you cater to sort of an upper class political clientele on Coruscant,
Right.
and you're also able to sort of feel them out and see who would be willing
Right.
to
Right.
step outside the box and help fund what we're doing. And I like how that guy, he's not necessarily a likable guy because he's just
No, he's saying that. He goes, "Listen, I'm here for the greater good, and there's going to be loss along the way." When he's talking to Sal Guerrera about how they have to sacrifice one of the players to accomplish their objectives, and he's like, "It's all part of the greater good, and that's what I'm in here for. I'm in it for the long haul. I'm in it for the end game." And yeah, there's going to be sacrifices. This is war, so he is not mincing those words. He's not, there is no hypocrisy in this guy. He's straight up.
right. And who would have ever thought whoever thought we see the day where you have a Star Wars movie or show with protagonists that dare to be unlikable? Who would have ever thought you would have seen that? I mean, the closest we probably got in the original trilogy was Han Solo, but Han Solo is one of the most likable characters in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
So,
And he was the anti-hero.
yeah. But here we get real actual anti-heroes where you're not always, you may understand why they do certain things, but you're not always comfortable with the things that they do.
Right.
And with this guy, you see if you become a liability to the mission, it doesn't matter how much you've done to help the
Right.
cause.
Right. It's the end game.
Yeah.
It's all about the end game, and everybody is pretty much expendable to some degree for the goal. The goal is to solidify the rebellion and take down the empire. That's the end game, right? So,
To the listeners that we have, and I'm very appreciative of all of you. I'm thankful that you listen to this show. Do you guys really understand what Andor is? And just how special this show is. I mean, it kind of sort of adds a balance to Star Wars. It kind of centers it. It kind of, if nothing else, because I've heard people say that, oh, nobody's interested in Star Wars anymore because of how Disney has handled it and how they've ran it into the ground. If you're a Star Wars fan, I don't see, especially if you're a Star Wars fan in our age range, if you're a first generation Star Wars fan, how could you not find Andor just completely fulfilling and entertaining?
right, and I think you think you just framed it right there. Depending on what generation you're in, depending on what age range you're in, right? So there's a whole generation that grew up on the prequels who love them. Whereas the old fuddy-duddies who grew up on the original ones 20 years before that are not as much of a fan. There's a generation now that have grown up on the sequels, episode 7, 8, and 9, who love those. And again, there are people who have mixed feelings. There's I guess what you consider to be the OG, the original Star Wars fans who consider the first three movies the purity or the purism of the franchise. And then everything that's happened before and after that seemed to be less pure. So there's a certain faction, and I would say I would probably fall into that category where I am more of a fan of the Star Wars purism of the first three movies and what they represented and everything about them. And I've been less of a fan of the prequels, and I tolerate the sequels. I find them entertaining, but I don't feel they really captured the magic of the first three movies. So everybody is Everybody is their own type of Star Wars fan. But I think what we should, if we are any kind of Star Wars fan, we ultimately should be grateful that there are, if you're a fan of Star Wars, it doesn't matter what Star Wars you're a fan of. If you're a fan, then we're all a fan. I may like ones differently than you do. I might have my favorites, but let's all agree that the Star Wars that we have, we should be thankful for. And that's kind of the topic of this one. Since we just missed Thanksgiving, we are thankful for Andor. I'm thankful that there's so many forms of Star Wars. Not all of it is my personal preference, but I'm glad that it's there. And I wouldn't want to say or do anything to discourage more Star Wars content from being created. It's not going to always be for me, but it is for everyone. And everyone will have their own kind of feel for that. So I feel Andor is I like as much as I did Rogue One, which I like as much as the first three movies, and they're all my most favorite. But yes, I like the prequels. Yes, I like the sequels. Yes, I like Mando. I had the only bad thing I could say about Mando was it did feel a little too family friendly for me, but it was still quality entertainment. It wasn't like talking down to me in a insulting kind of way. It was just not as gritty as me as an adult would have preferred that it was.
Right. Yeah. I don't have any problem with Mando because the thing I like about Mando is it does harken back to sort of that purity you mentioned in the original trilogy. I think that's why it's family friendly because it's sort of meant to conjure that same spirit of the adventure serials and whimsical, fantastical space opera. But Andor sort of, I think, points the way to a possible future for certain Star Wars properties. What if we had a show about the Jedi that had this same tone? What would that be like?
Like the Real Housewives, we'd get like the Real Jedi's,
Well,
something like that, right? So
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, like,
like the straight dope.
yeah, like,
Yeah,
what if we had something that looked at the Jedi from a bit less of a reverent standpoint
right.
and sort of looked at some of the darker tendencies? What could make, and again, spoiler territory, in Tales of the Jedi, they have Dooku. They show him as a Jedi first.
Right, because he
So
was.
yeah, so like, what could if you were to really do a show in the Andor vein about what could make certain Jedi turn to the Sith, turn to the dark side? I think that could be a very interesting take on the Jedi. But again, to bring it back to Andor, I mean, and I like how this show, there's not really an overall arc aside from the early stages of the rebellion.
Right.
There's there's many different arcs in here. The first three episodes are sort of a story unto themselves, and then you have the heist portion that takes place. That's a story unto itself. Then you have the prison portion, which is a story unto itself. And I think that's sort of I like that approach. I really do like that approach. Well, I'm more of a fan of stories that air weekly as opposed to
Binge it all.
the binge dump that
Right.
happens with other shows where they dump a bunch of episodes on you at once and then they end up kind of being this unwieldy thing. And then people always want to say, oh, it's like a 13-hour movie. It's like, yeah, there's no such thing as a 13-hour movie. It's it, it's just a big glob of sort of episodes put together. In a lot of cases, in my opinion, I just like this format better, and I like that you know there's little stories that stand on their own, but they fit into a larger sort of framework of just this is how the rebellion got started. This is the early days of the
Yeah,
rebellion.
yeah, and the real life sacrifices that were made to do that. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's like I say, there's no, I can't really think of anything I didn't like about the series. I did also I like the weekly because that fits better for my schedule. It gives me time to let it digest and marinate in my mind. All those good things. Yeah, I'm looking forward to a season two. I would imagine there has to be a season two on this. I don't know how much further they can take the Andor story because it's all leading up to Rogue One, and we already know how Rogue One ends. So I don't see them stretching this more than 3 seasons.
I say the same. I think 3 seasons.
Yeah.
You know
So
that.
But yeah, I love the prison. I love the fact that they're working on this and they don't even know what they're working on. They're just working on all these parts and they all look exactly the same. And everybody's just working on racks and racks of these widgets, whatever they are. And then of course at the end, you kind of have to figure it's not a stretch of the imagination if they're working for the Empire and they're working on building things. You know it's got to be something military based, and you know that this takes place leading up to the Death Star. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that they couldn't possibly be working on something that could be part of the Death Star, which, as we find out in that final kind of post-credit or mid-credit scene, that is literally what they're working on. They're working on the focusing beam of the laser that would end up blowing up the planet of Alderaan. So, really cool stuff, how it all ties together. But it's not fan service. It's not just giving you gratuitous ripping out pages of the Star Wars fanboy playbook. They're more like Easter eggs, and they're part of a tapestry. But it's not just gratuitous fan service, in my opinion.
Yes, and what I also like is this show, like I said, it answers a few fan questions and also fills a need for a certain fan base within Star Wars. And what I mean is, I've heard people say in the past that in the original trilogy, the only reason we know the Empire is evil is because the main characters keep telling us that they are. We don't necessarily see, and I've never understood this, but I've heard people say that we don't necessarily see.
How can you not think they're evil when the opening scene, they capture Princess Leia's ship, blast into it, kill all the rebels, he chokes a bitch, and then they're trying to kill Leia, and they capture Leia, and then they torture Leia, and they blow up her planet. They
have a weapon of
mass destruction.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, but I've heard people say, like, one reading, you could sort of read it as like the rebels are terrorists and so on and so forth, all these kind of crazy readings. But no, this show really, I think, gives you a ground level view. That whole prison portion, I mean, the way Andor gets arrested, and you're not even really sure what he gets arrested for.
It was a trumped up bullshit charge, and then he gets 6 years with no chance of parole or debating this or a reduced sentence or time off. And it was 6 years.
And then we realize that they really have no plans of letting anyone go. No one ever gets released.
No, they get switched to another floor.
Or they get killed.
If you outlive your usefulness, or you stop making your quota, your production metrics aren't what they used to be. Yeah, and it's because they can, on the one hand, could you get a droid to do this? Yes, but droids cost money. We're just imprisoning derelicts, and it costs us nothing but giving them some food paste and some water. Right. We're on a watered planet, so giving them the water they need to cost us nothing. Food paste is marginal expense.
And can we have a just a moment for Mr. Andy Serkis? Whenever I see that guy in anything, I light up right away. I like his presence. I like, I like what he brings to it. He sort of, to me, brings this real sort of melodramatic sort of British approach, to the whatever he's in. Yeah. And here he just really shines. I mean, you kind of are annoyed by his character at first, and then you just slowly,
because he's doing his job so well. He's like a company man. He's like, I've only got so many days left on my sentence, and I'm just trying to be the good prisoner so I can get out. So he is trying to be by the books. So let me say something about Andy Serkis. I agree with you. I like him. I'm a fan. I'm a fan of both him as the actor when he acts as a human form, and I'm also a fan of everything he's done as a motion capture actor. But I can't give him complete praise without calling him out on some douchey comments he's made in the past, because I've worked with people in the visual effects industry who have taken some umbrage with some of his comments, but because he has done a lot of the motion capture stuff, not only in the physical body performance, but in the face stuff too, he made comments basically saying that I'm not sure why visual effects animators get as much credit as they do because it's all in the acting, and that really rubbed a lot of the animators the wrong way. And I stand by them because I know how hard they have worked. I've worked in a visual effects sweatshop before, and I know the hours that go in the time and the talent and the technology involved. So while yes, he's a great performance artist and has done amazing work as both motion capture and he did King Kong, he did Gollum from Lord of the Rings and a bunch of other stuff, and he was Caesar in Planet of the Apes reboot, and he's a great actor and I love him. I gotta call him out on that douchey comment. So he was great in this.
Yeah, Andy, that's kind of self-aggrandizing there. But I mean, it's like, hey, we all have our flaws.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. But he was great. It was great to see him act as himself and not as a character, where he also played Snoke in the sequels.
Yes.
And Snoke was a really weird character that in a way I was kind of glad to see taken out, but also it was just a big letdown on the potential of what that could have been too. But we're not going to talk about the sequels. Let's keep it in Andor. But yeah, so he also, I read something recently where he was having a hard time taking the role because he's like, listen, I've already done a Star Wars thing. Even though he didn't do it as him, he did it as a CG thing, but he was able to justify the character and the difference in the character and all that kind of stuff. And he did an incredible performance, and it was a really cool character. And that thing at the end where he's telling giving him all information he needs to know to learn to escape, only realizing that escape leads to water and he can't swim. That was just like RIP. He knows he can't leave. As much as he knew right. I had, only had so many days left on my sentence and I was going to get out and this and that and the other. Now he realizes there's no getting out. Now he realizes there's no getting out for him because the prison break is a mad dash to water and he can't swim. Now, technically, could he have asked any of the thousands of people, dudes, help me out? Help me to shore, but
but I also like I like how he was sort of at peace with that. Like he was like, look, I got you guys out.
Yes. And we're ending the tyranny of at least one prison camp. Not all of them, but at least one of them.
And who knows how many prison camps the Empire has throughout the galaxy. Yeah. Who knows? But and it's also a commentary on the prison industrial complex in there too, of which I used to be a part for a short period of my life. But there is a commentary in there about it, about how sort of prisoners of any kind are sort of disregarded by the larger society because it's like, well, they deserve whatever they get, and you never know what kind of trumped up charges somebody might be jailed for. So, but again, it just adds, it adds a whole new level of desperation and despair to the universe of Star Wars that I think is just really cool, and it kind of shows a different way you can do Star Wars, because I was always afraid of the notion of an adult Star Wars for so long, because I know a lot of fanboys, we're always into this dark edgelord BS, where I know certain fanboys probably would love nothing more than, I remember somebody telling me that they'd love to see a Star Wars crime show in the vein of Goodfellas. And I love Martin Scorsese is my favorite director of all time, next to Spielberg. But if you've ever seen Goodfellas, so you want tons of profanity in a Star Wars movie. You want, no, I don't.
Yeah, I could just see Joe Pesci doing that. Wait, you got me in the pay no mind list? What's going on over here? It's like, but I'm funny to you. I make you laugh. When I clown to you, I amuse you.
but Steve, you know how us fanboys can be. We tend to have this sort of wet dream mentality with anything dark.
Be careful what you ask for, right?
Yeah, but Andor, I think, does it in a way. It's adult, but it's not profane. It's not offensive. It's not adult in that sense. It's adult in the sense that it has a tone that only adults are going to be able to really relate to.
Right.
and that is fine by me for Star Wars. It's
Right,
cool
right.
to
And
yeah.
while because it wasn't gratuitously violent, it wasn't over the top violent, but it wasn't, I don't think that a kid would find it as interesting because it wasn't that better, faster, stronger,
Yeah,
harder,
exactly.
go, go, go.
Yeah.
It wasn't a steamroller of a story, momentum. So while I don't think a kid would have been shocked and repulsed by it, he might have lost interest in the pacing of it because it was, that slow burn over 10, 11 episodes.
Oh, trust me.
It was satisfying for me as a
Yeah.
mature adult, if I can use the word mature, but as an adult, anyways.
Oh, trust me. I'm also betting there's a lot of adult Star Wars fans who thought it was too slow. I saw a few comments like that. It was just too
Yeah,
slow. And again, I'm thinking you guys aren't happy with anything. There's
yeah,
nothing.
yeah,
There's nothing they can do. You didn't like the prequels. You didn't like the sequels, and now they're kind of giving you what some of you say you want, but when you get it, it's
yeah.
like, oh no, it's too slow.
Haters
Pick a
gonna hate no matter what. Give them something new to hate. Give them something new to hate
as
on.
they say, pick a struggle.
Yeah,
Pick a
yeah.
struggle, people. Like
So I know you said you're short on time, and we've been doing this for about 45 minutes now. So I could do this some more, but I do have a little bit of news I would like your input on as well. So maybe let's go
go.
through some news, and then we can come back and wrap up Andor. Does that sound good to you, Mr. Wilson?
That's great. That's great.
Okay. And I'm trying to make news look better now since we are doing more live stream. So we didn't really do a lot of news in November, but I've kind of cherry picked some things that have gone on during the month. So one of those would be, well, we didn't talk about this, but Kevin Conroy, the voice of Batman in the animated series, died at the age of 66. And I know you did some posting on that, Scott. And I didn't watch a lot of the Batman the animated series, but I know he was also the voice of Batman in the video games too. So anything you want to add to that other than rest in peace?
Oh, I mean, what I would add to that is if you haven't watched a lot of it, I think on HBO Max they probably have it.
Yes.
Do yourself a big, huge favor and just watch some of those episodes, man. That was a classic show, and I agree with a lot of people. That was the most complete multimedia version of Batman. It didn't get more complete than that. It was almost like it encompassed every possible version of Batman from the comics that have existed since 1939, and they came up with the perfect amalgamation. They came up with the perfect sort of compromise between all those different versions of the character. And Kevin Conroy gave voice to that. And he was just so great at his job, man. I mean, the animated series is one of in terms of just overall geekdom and fandom over the past 30, 50 years, the Batman the animated series is one of the highlights of just period. Just period. It, and it and Kevin Conroy was an all-purpose, all-encompassing Batman. He could be funny. He could be dark and brooding. He could be sympathetic and vulnerable. He could be fearsome. I mean, that some of the best voice work in that type of cartoon, I think, of all time. He's what's the guy's name who voiced Megatron? Frank Welker. Uh, but just there's certain guys who've done tons of voice work,
Right.
and on the animated series, Mark Hamill famously voiced the Joker, and that's one of the best versions of the Joker that's ever existed.
Absolutely.
But Kevin Conroy, his jersey, it needs to be in the rafters. It needs to be shot up to the rafters on a bullet.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just he died relatively young, and I'm sorry to hear about that. But I mean, Mr. Conroy, thank you, thank you, thank you for
Yes.
everything you gave us, man. You went above and beyond in the biggest way, and nobody could ask for more than what you did with this character. Thank you.
Yeah. Rest in peace. And I didn't get a chance to enjoy the animated series too much. I will watch it as time permits, but I did dabble in some of the Arkham games. Didn't play them for very long, but I did find the voice expression to be really good. Matter of fact, one of the things that bothered me, and Rowdy has joined us, and Derpy's been
What's
commenting a
up,
lot
Rowdy?
too. We will get back to our live comments in a little bit. We just don't want to get pulled pulled too deep off the rails as we're trying to finish a discussion thread. But hey, Rowdy, hey, Derpy. Derpy's been very active in chat. Thank you, Derpy501st. But yeah, so I do want to catch up on some of the Batman animated series. So rest in peace, Mr. Conroy. You will be missed by fans around the world.
Steve, just in parting, dare I say that once you start watching the animated series, you'll have less use for the live action movies than you thought you did.
Okay, I've been warned. Now, I don't want this to be all about doom and gloom, but we have lost some other people too. We did recently lost Jason David Frank as well, who was the original Red Ranger, who went on to become the White Ranger and then the Green Ranger, and then came back for another series, which was Dino Power Wars or something like that, but best known for the original run of the Power Rangers. And then he went on to become a mixed martial artist. He was doing MMA fights. He actually came up with his own flavor of martial arts that he named and was very active. I was following him on social media. He was even doing something with GameStop where he was going to show up at some GameStops and sign autographs. And he's come to a lot of different Comic-Cons. Big supporter of the fans of the Power Rangers, both young and old, and he recently passed as well. So rest in peace to Jason David Frank as well. I'm not sure how much you watched him. I remember watching him as a kid because my kids watched the Power Rangers.
Well, this is one that I'm really not well versed in at all. I never really watched the Power Rangers at all. When that came out, I was 16. Yeah, I was 16, so I was still kind of a geek or a fanboy, but I had aged out of like the new stuff, newer things.
Right. I didn't watch them when they were new, but I watched them in syndication as my kids got older, including the original run. And God, he was so young. He was like a teenager when that first thing came out.
Right.
Really young, really great actors in there. And here's something that is most people might not realize, but if you have children who are not boys and you've got daughters and you go to find toys, because both my daughters like watching the Power Rangers and they both dressed up as the pink Power Ranger for Halloween many years, it's very difficult to find female Power Ranger action figures. It's very hard to find. You go into the toy store back when they still had a Toys R Us, you can find every colored male figure, but it's really hard to find female action figures. And if you've got daughters, that is a challenge. So I was luckily able to find a handful of Girl Ranger action figures over the years, and we did get the pink Ranger Halloween costume that my older daughter handed down to my younger daughter. So I've got two generations of kids who dressed up as Power Rangers. So as a parent, I got to enjoy them through my children. I didn't watch them when they were originally running, but I'm very familiar with Jason David Frank's very different versions of the characterizations. He came back for like a second generation later on of younger Rangers where he was like the mentor to them in the Dino Power run and stuff. And while it was good entertainment, there was a little bit of cheese to it, but I felt it was really wholesome quality fun. It wasn't this garbage, It was wholesome entertainment, the Power Rangers.
Right. And my son was a Power Ranger fan. When he was younger. My son is 18 now, so of course he's not into that anymore. The only thing he still kind of follows are the Marvel movies. But my son was a fan of it, and as far as this stuff goes, even if I'm not into it, I always recognize the importance of these things to other geeks and other nerds.
Absolutely.
This guy Jason David Frank is his name. Obviously, he
Tommy.
made some.
We will know him as Tommy.
Tommy
the Ranger.
Again,
yeah.
that just goes to show you.
Yeah.
That just goes to show you he made an impact. He
Absolutely.
left an impression.
Yes.
So again, Jason David Frank, thank you for what you gave to my son and so many other Power Rangers fans.
And to both my girls. Yeah.
You were significant. You will be remembered.
Yes. Amen. Now, more down news here. We're starting off with a bunch of downers, but everyone's favorite god of thunder, Chris Hemsworth, recently announced that he's taking a break from acting because he has discovered that he is at risk for Alzheimer's. Now, he's not currently presenting any symptoms whatsoever, but somehow figured out that he may start to suffer from it at some point in time. So has decided that, what's more important in life? Well, time with my family. And luckily the guy's made enough money where he can take it easy, but he's decided rather than just making movie after movie after movie, let me focus on what's important. Because I've had grandparents with both Alzheimer and dementia. And when you start to lose who you are, it's terrible for the person and the family around them. So I've experienced this. I'm sure a lot of people have, and so
Yes.
at least he's lucky enough to say, let me enjoy the time that I am able to remember. You know,
Yeah, I'm not happy to hear that at all. I mean,
no,
I know, one of my very favorite movie stars, Bruce Willis, of course, he announced, you know, a while back that he's suffering from some condition that affects his mental faculties and his ability to communicate. And I mean, that really hurt me because Bruce Willis is one of the greatest
absolutely,
ish talkers. I'll put it that way. You watch Die Hard to hear McClane's foul mouth. You watch Moonlighting to hear that character's banter. So that hurt me. And
yeah,
like
yeah.
and Chris Hemsworth now. I liked Chris. I've seen him in a few things. And I like the guy. I like what he brings to the screen. I like his persona. I like the characters he inhabits and the way he inhabits them. And it's just that would be really awful for it to happen to him. I hope he dodges that bullet.
Right.
I
And
hope he.
with everything else, the sooner you find out, the more you can do to prolong and delay the effects. And we're living in the modern age of medicine and technology. So, kind of like Michael J. Fox had outlived Parkinson's for a long time, or was able to deal with the effects of it and manage those for much longer than most people had prior to that. Let's hope that that's the same thing for Chris.
Yes. Chris Hemsworth, please hang in there. And
Yeah,
you've got the money and the resources. I know you're going to do everything you can to
which also reminds me
prolong
of
that.
Christopher Reeve, unfortunately, as we can sit here and dig up all the
Yeah.
tragedy where he was trying to find some stuff for his condition. But yeah, there's more to go. Now, this is not all doom and gloom. The news will get a little bit brighter here in the next few slides here. Sorry about that. But he also mentioned at the same time that he's thinking that if he's going to do Thor, if he does Thor one more time, that should be his last appearance as the Thor. Not only because of his condition, but he just feels that that character has run its course in his
Yeah.
opinion. So he has also said that his next opinion in as Thor in the MCU quote should be his last. Or that's what he
Yeah,
feels.
his version of Thor is
Yes.
definitely, I think, run its course. There's not a lot you can get out of his version of Thor.
Yeah. So, but I think he's left a great legacy for us. Now, on to, we talked about this recently. We talked about on our superfan discussion, James Cameron and the Avatar and the new Avatar. So this is a segue to a longer discussion. But recently, this comes from Variety. James Cameron says that he cursed out an executive who begged him to make the new Avatar movie shorter. And his response to that executive was, "Get the F out of my office." And I think you know what the F stands for, right? So that sounds like something you would expect James Cameron to say, where somebody's saying, "Dude, this movie's too long." Well, it gets better. So that is just setting up the next discussion point, which is the budget for the new Avatar, which is The Way of the Water. So the new Avatar, how expensive was the movie? This is from James Cameron himself. He says that it was the worst business case in movie history. This is the director of the movie saying this. And he goes on to say, for this movie to be profitable, you have to be the third or fourth highest grossing film in history. That's your threshold. That's your break even. Anything under $2 billion for the Avatar sequel would be a loss, according to Fortune. And the first Avatar still holds the record for the highest grossing film of all time with 2.9 billion on a budget of 237 million according to a Business Insider. So this is James Cameron basically saying I have now once again making the most expensive movie ever made, and I'm actually almost predicting that it might not be profitable.
Well, I'll tell you what. We've heard and read behind the scenes stories about James Cameron. One of my favorites is there was an actor on The Abyss who I think nearly drowned when they were filming that movie. The things I've heard about James Cameron, from a professional standpoint, the way he behaves while he's making these movies, the way he behaves on set, I'm not a fan of. I'm not a fan of any of that stuff. And I find his persona during interviews to be a little off-putting. You can kind of see the arrogance up front. I'll say this much: as far as how much money the movie has to make to be profitable, I'm not one to completely count him out because he was counted out for T2. That wasn't believed to be the best decision because at the time they didn't think a R-rated action movie starring Arnold Schwarzenegger could make a profit on $100 million budget. That was proved wrong.
Avatar proved him wrong.
Avatar, Titanic proved him wrong. Titanic was delayed. Titanic after the opening weekend, figures were made public. A lot of people thought it was a flop, but then it maintained that same number and even higher in subsequent weekends. The same thing with Avatar. So I don't count this guy out yet.
No. I think he's almost just stirring the pot right now. But I want to say something real quick about the Titanic. Whereas the making of the visual effects of Titanic is what caused the forming of the company Digital Domain, who I ended up working for. So if nothing else, I am grateful that James Cameron made the movie Titanic because people who left ILM started their own visual effects company that would become Digital Domain. I ended up working for a branch of Digital Domain when they opened up a studio that was here in Florida in our backyard, you and I, Scott. And it was a great experience working with some of the best people in the industry. So I'm grateful for that experience, which is directly descendant from what James Cameron did. So I'll just say thank you to that because I made some pretty good money during that time too. No complaints there either. So yeah. So I remember when Alan Murphy was saying he's not going to see it in the theater, but he will watch it. I will see it in the theater. I want to help contribute, $15 towards that $2 billion nut they have to do. So we'll see about that. Now this is news on the DC side. James Gunn, who is now the head of DC Studios, he made an announcement which says that the DC EU will be connected across film, television, and animation moving forward. And Gunn and his co-CEO Peter Safran are set to create a more cohesive DC extended universe over the next 10 years. And on top of that, they're even talking about video games, where future video games will all be canon and part of the same universe. Now, this is basically what Marvel's doing as well, but DC is on the course to integrate a tapestry that combines screens of different sizes and different formats. And I don't see that as a bad thing. I just think the same struggle is going to be quality over quantity, and I'm not overly concerned that they won't be able to achieve that. I think James Gunn did a great job with the Guardians of the Galaxy. He did a great job on the second Suicide Squad movie. So I think he has got the vision, and now he's got the power to do it. And I want to see him and DC succeed because if they win, we win because we've got great content to enjoy as fans.
I'm going to make this brief in saying that basically James Gunn is doing what DC should have been doing 10 years ago. And I'll leave it at that.
There we go. And that's all we have to say about news. Not a lot, but and there's a few things that I didn't capture, and I'll just maybe mention briefly. But one of them has been, surprisingly, we also talked about this last week too in our Superfan thing, but Quentin Tarantino has been talking a lot of smack lately about the MCU. He started off with a few posts in social media saying, well, number one, I would never direct a Marvel movie because Marvel directors aren't directors. They're just hired guns. They can't really do anything with their creative power. They just do what the studio tells them. So that was one of his first kind of shady comments. Then he goes on to say things like, well, Marvel movies, the actors aren't really actors. They're not movie stars. The heroes are the star. Captain America's the star. Iron Man's the star. The actors aren't movie stars. The characters are the stars. So he's kind of bad-mouthing that. So I don't know what stick got stuck in what part of his hind end that's causing him to have all this hate and shade to be casting towards Marvel. Maybe because he wanted to direct and they said, we're not interested. So now he's just shit talking. I'm not sure. But, okay, but you know what? Nobody cares what you think at this point, Quentin. Make your movies and let them make theirs.
Okay. I'm about to have a large portion of our fans or fandom in general chasing me through the street with pitchforks and torches. Okay, fellas, we've got to stop being so sensitive about the comments that some of these filmmakers make. And let me just briefly explain why. Look, Quentin is not saying anything that we as fans didn't already know. These observations have been made by tons of box office pundits when talking about the changing landscape of the marketplace right now. That's exactly what one of the reasons that Marvel, their formula has worked and worked so well, is because they sell characters. They're not really selling Chris Hemsworth, they're selling Thor. They're not selling Chris Evans, they're selling Captain America. That's their formula. Everything is based around the characters. Everything is meant to facilitate these characters. So that's not really an insult. What Quentin is saying. Quentin is a guy who was a kid during the 70s. He's a real filmmaker, a real artist. He's looking at it from that standpoint. He's looking at it. I read there was some interview. I can't remember if it was a podcast or what. Not too long ago, he said he wishes all this Marvel stuff would have happened 20 years ago when he still cared. But now he's 57 or his 50s or 60s or something. He doesn't care as much anymore. And that's fair. That's fair. Like
It's not his cup of tea as far as the movies he wants to watch.
it's not his cup of tea as far as the movies he wants to watch or make. But he said if he was younger, it might be a different story because he used to love Marvel when he
Okay.
was younger.
Okay.
There was a line that he put in Crimson Tide because he's done some script doctoring in his time, and in Crimson Tide there was a lot with Denzel Washington and Gene Hackman, where one of the characters, one of the naval officers on the submarine, got in a fight with the other because one of them said that Mobius's Silver Surfer was better than Jack Kirby's Silver Surfer. Only somebody that read Marvel comics could write something like that.
Okay.
But what he's saying is, and that I'm a big geek. I'm a Marvel fan. I mean, the action figures next to me. I mean, you know me.
Mm-hmm.
The stores we shopped at. But I'm also a fan of cinema, so I'm not limited to just that. And
Right.
I can understand the frustration that, wow, look at the landscape here. So much of popular cinema now is Marvel and superheroes. I think that's more what Quentin is speaking to. I didn't necessarily hear any straight up hate in what he said. That's
Okay.
just me.
Okay.
That's just me.
I didn't hear it as hate. It almost just
Yeah.
sounded like shade, some shite talk. And it's like, well, why? I mean, okay, you have an opinion. And again, this is probably just the media. Maybe somebody asked him, hey, what do
Yeah.
you think? And he gave an honest answer. And now those are becoming headlines that are being shot across the multiverse for everybody to chew on and interpret. But I also kind of feel like, yes, you're a filmmaker and this and the other. But if it's not for you, why do you even have to say anything then? If you could
That's
just
true.
say, don't comment, no comment, But somehow he expressed that opinion, which is our God-given right as Americans, the freedom of speech, assembly, and expression, right? So,
And also remember Sam Jackson, who is for all intents and purposes has always been the Robert De Niro to Tarantino's Scorsese. That's one of his favorite guys to use.
Samuel
And
L. Jackson?
and that's Nick Fury himself.
Yeah.
And Sam Jackson responded and kind of let it be known that he's not with Quentin on that. So
Okay. Well, because
you
he's
know
still got future paychecks that he's also
exactly.
relying on too. What's in your wallet, motherfucker? Right? So
Yeah.
he wants to know what he's going to get.
I mean,
So,
me personally, I'm not really sure if Quentin has the right approach for something like a Marvel movie. It would be interesting to see if
it
he
would
was.
be. There were rumors that he was going to do a Star Trek reboot as well.
Yeah.
That would have been interesting to see. What would his take on a Marvel film be? And maybe give him a chance to do something like the we didn't even talk about this too much, but the Marvel one shot with the Halloween thing, the Werewolf by Night, that was incredible.
Yeah.
And give him a one shot where, you know what? Here's the
And what would he
paintbrush.
choose?
Here's the paintbrush, Mr. Artiste. Now go paint some shit and shut the F up and let's see how good it is. Right? So
Well, I'd be interested to see what character he'd even want to do if he.
it
if
would
they
be
were
if you gave him free reign. Make a Marvel movie how Quentin Tarantino thinks it needs to be made. I would watch it. I would pay money
I
to
would
see it.
honestly,
Shut up and take my money right now.
honestly, a lot of people, a lot of my friends are going to kill me for saying this. I'd be very interested to see his take on Luke Cage or Power Man and Iron Fist.
Kind of like what he did with Django Unchained and whatnot. And
Yeah, I'd be interested to
yeah,
see because Luke Cage is pretty much a black exploitation
yes. And
character.
he did, was it Foxy Brown?
Yeah, he did a Jackie Brown.
Jackie Brown, sorry.
Jackie Brown.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
Jackie Brown.
I knew
So
I was going to screw that one up.
but you know, yeah, I used to.
Oh, Rowdy says Ghost Rider would be a good pick too. Yeah, I could totally see that.
I could see him doing Ghost Rider. Definitely, I would love for Nick Cage to come back to the role if Quentin were directing. That would be kind of a fun thing to
Yeah,
watch.
yeah.
But
And Nick Cage can come back in a lot of different ways as the same Johnny. Is it Johnny Cage? What's the Ghost Rider's name? Johnny Cage is the guy from frickin' Mortal Kombat. It's Johnny. It's not Johnny Storm.
Blaze.
Johnny
Blaze.
Blaze. Okay, Johnny Blaze. Right. So he could come back as the same Johnny Blaze, just older. And by the way, there's a third Ghost Rider movie that was probably straight to video and it's on streaming somewhere. I started watching the beginning of it. It looked halfway decent. I think Idris Elba was in it too, who I love. I don't think I ever finished watching it, but there's actually a third Ghost Rider movie with Nick Cage in it that I have not finished
You,
watching.
I think you're probably thinking about that second one that got made that nobody remembers. I think that might be what you're thinking
Well,
about.
it's one of 3 movies now because there was a second one in the theater. There was Ghost Rider 2 in the theater by the same studio, and then this is the third Ghost Rider movie that came out in like 2013, 2014. That I've only seen on streaming. I didn't know it was available. I didn't know it existed. But yeah, I think Nick Cage has still got the chops where he could play an older version of Johnny Blaze in the same character in the same timeline. He could be the guy who passes the torch. He could be somebody from a multiverse that kind of coexists with a newer Ghost Rider. There's a couple different ways they could do that. Now, technically, Ghost Rider-ish is sort of in the MCU because there was a version of Ghost Rider in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which took place during the Phase 1 and 2 of the Avengers, which technically is canon. So there is a version of Ghost Rider, not that well known, that could count. Not the same. It wasn't Johnny Blaze, though. It was a different iteration of him. But yeah, that would be interesting to see and to see a Tarantino on that. What I really like too about this is before they had the whole MCU. When they did the Ghost Rider movie, they didn't try to change the fact that this was supernatural. That basically he made a deal with the devil and his powers are supernaturally based and he's fighting supernatural enemies. Where with the Ang Lee Hulk, they couldn't just be good enough to say gamma radiation made me a superhero. There had to be this pre-existing condition that was set off by gamma. They tried to add some fact to the fiction. This one just said, we're going straight up fiction. This is supernatural. This is the devil, Bobby Boucher, and it's all good. So I'd love to see some darker Ghost Rider stuff.
Perhaps. I mean, we'll see. We'll
Yeah,
see.
and he's a good character to go dark with too. Cool. All right, so I think we've rounded out news, and we are now at the roughly. I think we've been streaming for an hour and 12 minutes. So I know you were short on time today. Is there anything else we need to say about Andor before we wrap up?
No, I think we've pretty much put the period at the end of the sentence.
Yeah.
Like,
Great series.
yes.
I am
One of the
grateful for it.
One of the best things to ever bear the Star Wars name. If you aren't watching it, start now.
Yeah, and Mandalorian Season 3 is coming soon. Let's just get back and look at some of the comments we had in the live chat that we weren't able to look at. So Derpy gave us... Oh, so he says, I will say this, though. When the marching band scene happened, when they started walking towards the barricade and the music tone changed, I felt empowered, and I had chills and goosebumps to fight back. You remember that scene when they were getting ready to head to the funeral?
Yeah.
That was right before
Great
the
scene.
finale. Yes. Derpy also says, I grew up on the prequels, but I know the original trilogy is a better saga from story and film. And Kenobi is mid-average. And then he went on to rank the movies in his personal order from worst to best. So he put The Last Jedi at 11, Solo at 10, Rise of Skywalker at 9, Attack of the Clones at 8, Force Awakens at 7, Phantom Menace at 6, Rogue One at 5, Return of the Jedi at 4, New Hope at 3, Revenge of the Sith at 2, and Empire Strikes Back at 1. So that's Derpy's order of his favorite Star Wars movies from worst to best ranking. And then talking about the sequels, he said, I would rather watch The Room, Howard the Duck, and The Last Airbender before even Dragon Ball Revolution ever than to rewatch the sequels. So not a fan of the Star Wars sequels. Rowdy says Batman the Animated Series is the greatest animated series ever. When we were talking about James Gunn, he said he's doing what fans have been waiting for DC to do since the inception of the DCEU, which is what you said, Scott. Mm-hmm. And Rowdy also said Ghost Rider is something he would like to see Tarantino do. So we're caught up on the live chat. Thanks, guys, for hanging out with us today.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
And all right, so we'll put a fork in this episode 26, that we're calling Thankful for Andor. And who knows what we'll talk about next week, but I'll go ahead and talk over the outro, and then we can definitely put a fork in this episode. All right, so this completes episode 26 of Culture Goes Pop, the podcast. Visit us on the web at culturegoespop.com. Send us email at show@culturegoespop.com. We are a podcast available wherever you get your podcasts. We are on Apple, Amazon Music and Podcasts, Anchor FM, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and other places, wherever the heck you get your podcasts. While you're listening, don't forget to rate and review the show to help us grow the audience, and we appreciate you tuning in every week. And that's all we have to say about this week's episode. Final parting thoughts, Scott Wilson.
None at the moment. Just watch Andor.
Watch Andor. Watch Andor. Make Star Wars great again with Andor.
Right.
All right. We're going to press the button and end the show. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye, everybody.